End of March 1945. The last major Allied bombing raids on Berlin are taking place, just a few days before the Soviet ground assault. After 4.5 years since they began to bomb the capital of the Reich, the Allies have dropped on it the equivalent of 4 atomic bombs like those dropped on Hiroshima. With the British bombing at night, and the Americans during the day, it is estimated that more than half of the city is razed to the ground, and between 30,000 and 45,000 people have died as a result of these bombings. However, and if this were not enough, the true destruction of Berlin would take place during the Soviet assault that began on April 16. After taking the city, Soviet General Nicholas Berzarin ironically said that the British and Americans had needed years to drop 65,000 tons of bombs on Berlin, while they had dropped 40,000 tons in just 2 weeks. Clearly what this general was referring to was the bombardment that the Soviet artillery had carried out during those last 2 weeks of April. Seeing this, we can get an idea of the great devastation that Berlin suffered throughout the Second World War. But, what was the first bombardment you suffered? When did the most powerful bombardments on the capital of the Third Reich take place? What was the rate of bombers shot down during these raids? Well, these questions and many more are what we are going to solve next. The first bombardment of Berlin was carried out by a lone French plane during the night of June 7 to 8, 1940, when his country was already practically defeated. Although this attack was only an anecdotal event, and only dropped 8 bombs, it was the first of many, and it made Hermann Göring look very bad, who had promised that something like this would never happen. On the other hand, the most important thing about these first air raids was the fear that the civilian population would be bombarded with gas, which would have caused millions of deaths in just a few air raids. Although both sides were prepared and had the capacity to do so, they never put it into practice because they knew that the reprisals would be catastrophic. To make a comparison, they represented the same thing that atomic bombs represent today. Subsequently, the first serious bombardment of Berlin occurred during the night of August 25 of that same year, once France had already fallen, and the Battle of England was being fought between German and English aviation. 81 planes participated in this raid, which managed to drop some 22 tons of bombs on the German capital. This was followed by other attacks on August 29, September 4, and another series of days during that month. These last attacks did manage to drop their bombs on the center of Berlin and cause a few dozen victims. In any case, these first attacks hardly caused material or human damage, and as a general rule, the casualty rate among the participating aircraft was high. This led many to question whether it was worth continuing with this type of operation, to which the RAF Air Chief of Staff at the time, Charles Portal, said, "Just for getting 4 million people out of bed and putting them in the shelters every night is worth it." In this way, it was clear that the psychological factor is very important, and the feeling of not being able to sleep a peaceful night is eroding people's well-being. During 1941, the bombing raids on Berlin continued, and increased a bit in intensity, although it was not at all alarming yet. Furthermore, beginning in June, the Soviets also sent several air raids on the capital of the Third Reich, which only managed to drop some 36 tons of bombs. Most of these planes took off from the island of Saaremaa in present-day Estonia, which quickly fell into German hands. The largest bombing raid of that year of 1941 occurred on November 7, in a raid by over 160 bombers that caused virtually no damage due to bad weather. In addition, 21 of them were shot down, and this led to the dismissal of the head of the British Royal Air Force Bomber Command, and it was then that said position was assumed by the famous Arthur Harris. As you know, the air raids that this man organized were so brutal that they earned him the nickname of Butcher Harris. Before continuing with the next few years, we have to indicate that the effectiveness of the nighttime bombings was very low, and large fleets of aircraft had to be used to achieve significant damage. This way of acting using huge bomber formations began to be used little by little from the years that we are going to see below. To give us a better idea, during the first 4 years of the war, only 10% of the bombs that the Allies dropped on Germany were dropped. In total, this 10% corresponds to some 90,000 tons of bombs. The remaining 870,000 tons, equivalent to about 54 atomic bombs like the one on Hiroshima, were dropped during the years from 1943 to 1945, the strongest year being 1944 with more than 500,000 tons. Continuing where we left off in 1942, we have to say that this was a year of transition, in which there were only a few insignificant bombing raids on Berlin. However, it was important because of the entry into service of the Lancaster bomber, and because of the entry of the United States into the war from December 1941, which began to provide huge amounts of war material. Thus, and to ensure these supplies, most of the actions that were carried out in 1942 were aimed at winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Everything changed during the year of 1943, in which Carcenero Harris was able to put into practice all his ideas about area bombing. Before focusing on Berlin, Harris carried out one of the first trials in what is known as Operation Gemara, which consisted of a series of attacks on Hamburg. Although to date fleets of between 100 and 200 bombers had been used in the various air raids, from this point on that figure rose to more than 700 aircraft. In addition, the city was not only bombarded for one or several nights, but the agony for the civilians lasted for many days. In Hamburg, one of these great bomber fleets was sent out for 7 days, from the end of July to the beginning of August 1943. Of the more than 5,000 bomber sorties that took place during those 7 nights, the Allies they lost about 175 aircraft that were shot down by the Germans. In all, an estimated 35,000 civilians were killed, and more than 150,000 injured. In addition, they forced another almost million Germans to have to leave the city permanently. So after doing this first experiment, it was the turn of Berlin. It was at this point that Harris famously said that raising Berlin would cost them the loss of between 400 and 500 planes, but it would cost Germany the war. It should be noted that while this was taking place in the heart of Germany, on the Eastern Front everything was going from bad to worse for the Germans after the failure of Operation Citadel and subsequent Soviet counteroffensives. In this way we can see that by the end of 1943, it was more than ever clear that the situation was only going to get worse. It was from November 1943 when the real agony began in Berlin, which would last until the end of the war. During this month, the first massive incursions through the capital took place, the one on the night of November 22 being the most effective that had been carried out to date. The action was carried out by 440 Lancaster's bombers that damaged numerous residential areas and government buildings, and caused a great fire that spread throughout the city. From here, this series of massive attacks was repeated continuously, leaving by the end of that year, 1943, a quarter of the city destroyed. As we already commented in a recent video, we must remember that in Berlin there were 3 large anti-aircraft towers whose mission was to defend the city, but despite their magnitude, they were unable to face these massive air attacks. Although the last months of 1943 were hard, they were only the appetizer of what was to come during 1944. This was the year in which all records were broken, while the number of planes lost in each raid was 8%, this figure being quite acceptable. This year was characterized by a series of continuous raids, although the strongest bombardments of Berlin took place during the first months of 1945, when Germany was already completely surrounded, and Hitler had already installed himself in his bunker in the city. It was specifically the night of February 3rd, when a real hell broke loose over the city, after an air raid involving 1,500 bombers and 1,000 American fighters. This date also coincided with the arrival of the Soviets on the banks of the Oder River, now less than 70 kilometers from the German capital. Although there was some American general who refused to carry out such an attack in which thousands of civilians would die, Eisenhower justified it as necessary to support the offensive that the Soviets were carrying out on the Oder. Because the German anti-aircraft defenses were low on ammunition, only 36 aircraft were shot down in this raid, representing only 1.4% of the total. On the other hand, the number of German casualties exceeded 20,000, and another 120,000 people were left homeless. With this we have that until the end of March 1945, the Allies had launched a total of 314 air raids on Berlin, increasing the magnitude of each of them progressively. As we have commented at the beginning of the program, after more than 60,000 tons of bombs dropped on Berlin, more than half of the city was destroyed, and more than 40,000 lives were lost. The only reason why this number of victims was not higher was because there were numerous anti-aircraft shelters in the city, in which the population could take refuge. Well, what is your opinion about these massive bombing campaigns? Do you think they were used for something? If you want to see the program of the anti-aircraft towers in Berlin with which the Germans tried to protect themselves from this, I leave said program in the description.